Welcome to Detonation Point. I'm your host, Matt O'Neill. I was with the U.S. Secret Service for 25 years and retired as the Deputy Special Agent in charge of the Cyber Operations part of the Criminal Investigative Division. In Detonation Point, I'm going inside the fight against cybercrime, hearing directly from defenders in government, infrastructure, and enterprise who are racing to stay ahead, because cybercrime isn't slowing down, and neither can we. Welcome to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. Welcome back to Detonation Point, presented by Elastio. This week we have Derek Wood on. Derek, thanks for joining us today, my friend.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, hey, can you just give the listeners a little bit of background about yourself? And then we're just going to dive into some really interesting topics that we haven't brought forward so far on this podcast.
Yeah, I'm getting up in age now. I'm looking down the barrel of 40 later this month. So I realize I've been in the startup
My condolences.
game. Yeah, my back too. But, I realize I've been in the startup game for 20 years now, and I'm actually old enough to remember when we were all bootstrapped, and that was the way to go. And that profitability was actually an aim of the industry, like holistically across industries. And so I've gone through the ringer of early stage, Series A through usually C, and typically focused in heavily regulated industries. So making sure that the software systems that are being used have the security, privacy, and governance necessary for working with local, state, federal government agencies, hospitals, big finance, things of that nature. And in my own time, I like to coach my son's teams and stay active and have a lot of fun being terrible at instruments.
What instruments?
I started teaching myself string instruments. You have a kid and people send a bunch of junk instruments for the baby. And I thought, okay, well, I can't feed him right now, so I guess I have to teach him how to play. And I started having a lot of fun with a harmonica.
No kidding.
And then my wife said, please learn a different instrument.
Yeah.
And so I went to a ukulele, and then that's graduated to a guitar. So I'm just kind of using the YouTube University to painfully make my way through a little bit of fun and relaxation.
So you're not going to be the next John Popper from Blues Traveler for the harmonica? That's not in the future?
Definitely not. Although when it does come on, I always tell my son, I was like, this is a harmonica. And he's like, what? It can sound like that? And I was like,
Could have been me.
You wouldn't know it hearing me, right?
Yeah. So you mentioned the startup space and how everybody used to be bootstrapped. One of the things that surprised me when I was still in government was at RSA in 2023. I was still running the Secret Service's sort of cyber investigative portfolio, and I was meeting with some companies, and they were brand new companies that had interesting technology. And I was so naive to the world where they're like, "Oh, come meet us in our suite at the St. Regis or at this." I'm like, "How do you guys afford? Like, you're bootstrapped. Like, who's paying for this?" And this was just my naivety. I was like, if I was an investor, I'd be pissed. You guys are spending all this money in this massive suite. And then I've seen these guys at like 3 other places along. Do you see that often where it's like, man, I'm spending other people's money. This is just part of the gig. They explained, and I agree, like those meetings at RSA are much more productive than meeting on that silly floor that they have that's like, the bizarre marketplace or anything like that. But at the same time, it was just like pretty extravagant for a startup.
Yeah. What I've seen, and maybe I'm not wholly right on it, but in my experience, what I've seen is the VCs used to be primarily folks who were successful as business leaders. And then they had a bunch of money, and then they said, okay, I don't want to do all the hard work anymore, but I want to invest and advise other people and use my expertise to help them succeed as I did. Let's pay it forward and help each other out. And then as the years went on, so much money got involved in the tech space. The VC in the financial markets started consuming talent from every other market, right? You see stories all the time of like, oh, this guy used to be a top tier engineer for this biomedical company, and now he's a VC guy. And so now you have VCs that are mostly financial folks, and they don't have a lot of experience with like boots on the ground building a business. And so the advice they get and the things they want to see, I typically find go against like basic principles of lean business development, which is if you're going to spend $1, you got to make 8. Right. Mm-hmm. And in the early stages of an organization, it's hard to balance that because your VCs, who are mostly financial people now, they want to see your name in big spaces. They want to see you in conversations with companies that are recognizable to the layman. And that may not be your target audience. And the effort at these big trade shows is largely brand building, which you can't ignore, but you can't mistake brand building for lead development. And that's a big problem companies get into is, they're kind of pressured into doing these things that are not going to be directly tied to revenue and would be very difficult to measure. And typically it's an investment in the future, right? Like you should be going to these shows, but
Mhm.
at early stages, it's always about doing more with less. And if you end up with a big bag of money, then it's easy to get pressured into these things that don't actually have the prioritization they have in terms of how to build a business, but they meet the prioritization of your board. And so it's a hard balance. And it's one of the things that I do with my fractional business. Like before I get in with an early stage company, I want to see that the founders have experience founding. I
Mhm.
want to see that they have some expertise and passion in the problem they're solving. And I also want to understand how their relationship is with their board. Who's guiding who? Is the board just money and they're angry because they're not seeing ROI? Or does the board consist of experts that can help move things forward? And if there isn't that expertise in the board, then almost always the first step for me is to say, okay, well, we need to go get a serious board of advisors who can actually help us, because the money side, they can maybe find those introductions for us, but they're not the ones that are going to help us build this business.
Yeah, and so in my workings with a bunch of different businesses from different stages as well, I have noticed the role of an advisory board or board of whatever you want to call them varies greatly in the engagements that they have with the company. And I feel like the ones that are more actively leveraging their advisory board, whether it's to gain access to individuals, like there's a purpose. And then others where I sit and listen, where it's just like, oh, we're just going to brief you on this other stuff and then we'll see you in 4 months. Do you see that as well? And I find like one's kind of a waste and the other one provides a lot of value because you have a bunch of people that are more actively working. And I've always wondered what the not being a founder of, like, aside from an advisory company, like what's the mindset of not opening up more to an advisory board?
Yeah, and that's how we met, right?
Yeah.
Was you came on as an advisor for us when I was with Duality, and that was again like the exact storyline, which is we need experts in this industry to help us get the conversations with the people we need to have those conversations with, who can speak from authority that is recent. Right. Like if I have, even let's say a CMO from that hasn't worked in a startup company in more than 5 or 6 years, their experience is pretty limited in the like tactical advice they can provide. Strategically, they're going to be perfect, but it's also a matter of hiring. I've seen boards like dictate out requirements for who you go to hire, and they're like, we want you to go pick up somebody that comes from major enterprise. It's like that's a completely different motion.
Mhm.
Like I'm a quintessential startup guy, so that means I'll come in with one specific role, but you have to be a tight knit team, right? Like you're never going to have enough resources to do everything. So you're going to have moments where you're going to wear different hats. You're going to have to develop expertise very quickly. And it really just becomes more of like, I think of startup professionals as being like operational experts before anything else. What I really love is with AI, because that has really lowered the barrier to entry. Like I don't need to hire as many people to run specific operations as I used to. I think we're actually starting to see a trend back to kind of bootstrapped organizations, just because it's a lot faster and cheaper to get going nowadays. But the expertise is really something that I think has been consumed by the money you can make by going purely in a financial direction straight out of college, let alone shifting later in your career. So the people that have access to that sort of money, that's a really great way to go do that. I wasn't raised with that kind of money. So like I volunteer as an advisor at the Atlanta Tech Startup Village, which is now the third largest in the country. And it's really interesting and fun for me because it gets to sharpen my tool set, right? Like it's kind of like having a batting coach, making sure you're not dropping your elbow.
Yeah.
You think you're a professional, but you still need a coach. And just switching from industry to industry with all these different startups serving different markets, it really helps me maintain focus in the industries that I have been in for decades. Because it's like, okay, like we're making some assumptions. I've got bias eyes on this. And then, shifting to something that has nothing to do with security or privacy suddenly like makes me realize like, well, you know what? We kind of skipped some steps here that would have been
Right.
better not to have skipped. So it's kind of bringing back that human connection and human discussion, especially with misuse of AI in the same respect. Like I don't need to hire these experts because I can have this magic machine tell me the answers. That's a misstep. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about arming experts with a team of agents that give them a force multiplication effect so that instead of a team of 6 people on an outbound marketing team, maybe I only need 2. Or I have the same 6, but their quality and their volume of
Yeah.
deliverables just goes off the chart. So I feel like it's going in the right direction. Statistically, VC funded companies are down across the country. The Silicon Valley with, a lot of defense contractors and AI companies is like the only region that's really continuing to see VC funded startups. I think crowdfunding is becoming far more popular, especially since you don't need much more money, right? Like, with AI, maybe I need $500 a month on top of what I need for my salary. And now I'm a, 2-man shop. And instead of needing a few $1 million in a seed round, maybe I only need a couple 100,000. And so there's different avenues opening up with how the labor needs have been changing. But I think it's a good shift. I think, frankly, it's healthy. Um, I'm,
We
I'm I'm excited about it.
Yeah, we had Carl Walk on, who's the CEO of Merlin Technologies, and their AI is more generated by they'll call it human in the loop AI, but it's really the models are trained off of human expertise and not off of data. So then, therefore, in your example where you have 6, you might only have 2, but the other they're moving further right of the problem. And so now, whether it's in a scalable challenge or even in a smaller like marketing, they're doing higher level things. One of the things that attracted me to that conversation was what you kind of just briefly mentioned was trust or lack of trust or misuse of AI. Talk to me a little bit about where you see this sort of challenges right now with kind of trust in AI as it relates to things like, policy, business people, like what worries you?
I'm probably in a small niche because I've worked in security and privacy, and I'm assuming a lot of this audience is also going to have somewhat of
Hmm.
that background. And we have to realize that we are, despite the knowledge that we have in this industry, we are in a minority of appreciation for these concepts. So, like trust, I define as a combination or concatenation of all the risk categories: security, governance, regulatory compliance, privacy, all of it wrapped up is trust in my mind. So, when we look at the issue of trust, like I thought we learned these lessons. Like looking back to how we built software in the early 2000s, like I look back now and I feel embarrassed about some of the things that we did and how we program things, like the developer secrets, just plain text and log
Hmm.
files and things of this nature that we never really thought of. And the mentality was let's move fast and be the leaders in this innovation, and we'll fix things later. Like we'll
Hmm.
fix that stuff later. Like, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. And I thought we learned the lesson that technology moves too quickly to do that.
Hmm.
And
And the consequences, right?
oh
I
God,
mean, yeah.
I love Tim Brown from SolarWinds. He and I were chatting. He gave me an analogy to, the risk category of technology being akin to brakes on a race car. And nobody gets on the podium after winning a race and says, hey, I want to thank my brake company. Without them,
Hmm.
I couldn't go as quickly into those corners as I did to win that race. Even though that's a fact, no one celebrates the brakes, right? It's all about the engine, the transmission, the suspension, the tires, everything but the brakes. And so the whole shift left movement that really kind of gained some traction, arguably still didn't accomplish much. We're still talking about it. We're now seeing at a scale and a speed that is terrifying, right? Like
Hmm.
it used to be fast that if you came out with a feature in your software that truly differentiated you from the market, you only had about 6 to 8 months before somebody checked that box off as well. And maybe they didn't do it as well, but no one cares about better than, right? That's a
Hmm.
swear word in my world as a product leader. So now foundational models that we're building upon are changing on a monthly basis. And it's only getting faster. Like the speed of innovation is accelerating, especially now that we're seeing companies like Claude who just came out and said, you know what? Humans didn't do a whole lot in this last update. It is so fast. And it wouldn't make sense. Like we know where this is all going. And I don't think that it's a fair argument to say we have to run this race car around the track without brakes because we don't want the other race car to beat us. Well, what's stopping us from crashing?
Mm-hmm.
We have the technologies available today to do everything that we want to do, but in a safe and secure manner. And we're just lying to ourselves when we say, oh, this is just red tape. You have the concept of regulations, and there is truth to overregulation, but there is also regulations that are written in blood. There's a reason we have rules for OSHA. It's not to make it more expensive or laborious to build buildings. It's so that we don't kill people in the process.
Right.
And so in the digital world, like one of my big concerns is how we talk to our children about this. My son's 10 and he came home a couple months ago and one of his friends is a couple years older. And he said, why can't I have a cell phone? My buddy has one. And I said, well, because I haven't prepared you for that yet. And you say, well, what do you mean? And I was like, well, my job as a parent is to prepare you to go out independently and safely into the real world. Now we have two real worlds. We have the physical world and we have the digital world. How would you feel if I just dropped you off in some strange city with $100 and said, I'll see you tomorrow? Like, would you be comfortable with that? And he goes, definitely not. And I'd say, great. Like, that's exactly why I'm not going to give the world access to you. Right.
Mm-hmm.
In the early days of the internet, it was a groundbreaking individual access to a world of information. As we've monetized our access to this information, it's now more lopsided towards your connected devices are connecting companies to you, not you to information. And it takes a lot of human behavior and introspection to understand the caveman instincts that they capture our attention with. And, we've heard things like the dopamine economy, which is absolutely real. In that same RSA, I think it was 2022, I was working with a company and we did a presentation for the Innovation Sandbox on the surveillance economy. And that was not new back then. We had the Snowden revelations in the early 2010s, which were found to all be validated by the Supreme Court. Like, this is not new information. We've had sci-fi about it, but we're now kind of living in this world where we no longer really have a choice. It's this pervasive surveillance. We see the lawsuit with the Meta glasses this current week. Our devices, our vehicles, our computers, they are no longer balanced towards benefiting us as much as it's benefiting other entities by capturing our information and our attention. And the two are kind of the same coin. So I'm really concerned about the de-evolution of critical thinking skills. One of the things I talk about with my son and working on a presentation for his school, because I opened my mouth to the faculty and they asked me to follow up, is the difference between information, knowledge, and expertise, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like anything that you hear, whether it's from you, like you have expertise. So what you say carries a lot of weight. Right. But for me, you're just another data point. I've not gained your knowledge by repeating what you've said. So I have to understand that knowledge is a result of effort and analysis. So it's not enough to read one book on a topic. You need to read 4 books on a topic. And then you analyze all the insights from these experts to see, where's the overlap? Where do these data points overlap? That's probably true. And then where do they differ? And then those are probably more subjective and have a higher degree of error. And then once you've put in enough time to looking at information and extracting knowledge on a particular topic, you can start navigating and even better addressing nuance. And that is what I define as expertise. So I had one client that I was advising, and he told me he had product market fit. And I said, great, where's the product? He's like, oh, we haven't finished building it yet. And I said, okay, well, what are you talking about then?
Right.
And he put this beautiful post on LinkedIn later that cited all these measures like, oh, product market fit is when you see CAC going down and LTV going up, and the intersection of the two is blah, blah, blah. And I was like, you know what? Like, that's not necessarily wrong. It's just completely irrelevant to a company at your stage.
Hmm.
Your early stage acquisition costs are always going to be high because you're still going through product market fit. You want to handhold your design partners. Your lifetime value, how do you even know until you have a few years of subscribed users? You're projecting, and you may have goals, but you don't know any of that. And so I decided to ask the question into Gemini, and nearly verbatim, that's where he got that post from, was just using an LLM.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and it's funny because this Dunning-Kruger effect, it used to be, well, I guess for those who aren't familiar with it, it's when you assume expertise because you repeat someone
Mhm.
else's words, right? Whether they're an expert or not, it doesn't matter. You assume an expertise or like strong knowledge on a topic with only a few data points. And that used to be really common among academics and extremely successful people because you typically hang out with like people.
Mhm.
So if I'm hanging out with you, I may take, and I probably do, I probably have absolutely repeated Matt O'Neill in private conversations as my own
Yeah.
expertise.
Yeah.
And and that's because you're an expert. So I trust you that your expertise is enough that I can repeat it without sounding silly. But if somebody were to really dive in afterwards and ask me a nuanced question, I may be out of water because I don't have that expertise. But now with an LLMs that have the world's information available, everyone is falling into this trap. And it is really frustrating, especially when you're trying to make real decisions. We're going to redirect $500,000 a year of company focus based on an output that doesn't address nuance or that we
Mhm.
haven't properly set it up to address that nuance. And that's part of what I'm working on with one of the companies I'm really excited about right now, which is Sapiens, but it allows us to do that. But I think it's going to be a big problem for a long time. And it's going to be us old folks screaming at the clouds saying, you can't trust that. And even when these companies come out and say, like, oh, yeah, the AI search results on Google are only 65% accurate, no one reads below those results anymore.
Mhm.
Right? It's affecting SEO. It's affecting everything from education, business operations, casual conversations, politics, and depending on which AI model you're using, like Grok is going to give you something completely different than Claude. So how do you, again, with this overload of information, it's changed as much as it's always been true. You got to trust but verify everything. But I think it's becoming more challenging because of the assumed expertise and trust we put into these systems. And I think that's one of the reasons that we see adoption also and adoption fears growing, right? Adoption is still not really where we thought it would be, and for good
Mhm.
reason. Adoption fears are not paranoid. I think they are valid. Like, this is happening so fast. Like, if we give doctors an AI agent to do, assessments on patients, can we trust that the doctors are actually going to follow through with the verify part of trust but verify? Or are they just going to trust the output of the model?
Mhm.
We already see lawyers doing this, showing up to courtrooms with made up court cases. Like, if
It's
that's
just
already
lazy.
happening.
Yeah, you didn't even bother to do any research. When did you first notice this epidemic that's going on that was like the old commercial, like, "Oh, I'm not a pilot, but I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night." Like that's what's going on. For me, it was COVID. Like everybody's an expert in, infectious diseases. And then it became everybody, those same people that you see online who are the loudest about it, also then became experts in like constitutional law and elections. And then there's this side thing that I'm sure you've noticed as well is like the outrage industry. Like everyone's outraged about everything. And these people don't know anything about what they're talking about. Like I always love people that will say, I really don't know. How often do you hear that now? And so just to give an example is I see a lot online about people posting about like Israel, Palestine, like Gaza, and they act like they know everything about that part of the world. But going over there on a regular basis, it's a really, really complicated issue. Yet it's all brought down into these 30-second, 20-second bites that they're just, screaming from the mountaintops on, but they're being manipulated and they don't even know it. And
Yeah.
that's a real problem. But for me, it was COVID. COVID was where like these people think they're experts and they literally don't know anything and they want to argue and fight with their neighbors about it. I don't remember a time before that. And maybe that's just the intersection of mass adoption into social media. Maybe it's only when I started paying attention. I don't know. When did you first notice that?
Well, I guess I'll have two answers. One is like when I think I actively started noticing it, and then in hindsight, where I actually first experienced it. I feel like I first started really seeing it right after Obama was elected in 2008 in the Tea Party movement. And there was just such a drum up of rage. It was the first time that we really saw FUD add the A for anger in, how you grab people's attention. And it turns out anger is more effective than anything, more effective than sex, drugs, and rock and roll combined, right? It's outrage. And it taps into that caveman instinct of protecting yourself. And the COVID, I think, really exacerbated the echo chambers. So it kind of took what was already a growing problem, and then we were stuck inside. We didn't have human to human communication anymore. We just had, chest up podcasts and video calls. And this only gets so much of communication, right? Like if we really were going to get together and solve a hard problem, I'd say, Matt, where should we meet? Right? If we're just reporting back and forth and it's rather asynchronous, then fine, email, chat, whatever. But if we're really trying to understand, and especially if you have a team, not everyone speaks up in the same volume, but it doesn't mean not everyone has good thoughts. A lot of time, I'm a non-technical technical product leader. So like I've never written a line of code, I've messed around with some APIs here and there, but that's not my job. And so when I'm asking the engineers what's going on, I like to do it in person. We're having real hard discussions because I'll see the quiet people in the room kind of squirm when we say something. And they're not, I wouldn't say brave, but it's not their social style to speak in front of a bunch of people. So they just stay quiet. So I'll look for those squirms and then I'll go take those folks out to lunch or dinner and, try to get them a one-on-one where the guards come down. And that's where some of the best innovations I've had in my career have come from was just that interaction. In hindsight, I think the first time I really saw like honest, aggressive stupidity is one way to put it. There's a good paper that everyone should look up called The Laws of Human Stupidity, which is both hilarious and kind of humbling because you start finding yourself on the graph of stupidity and you're like, oh crap, I'm in this segment.
Yeah.
But the unfounded expertise, right, is what I mean by aggressive stupidity. It was really right after 9/11. I was in high school and I saw the anger that permeated all of society. Anyone who raised a question of, are they the right folks, was suddenly anti-American and would just get blasted from everyone, whether you were at your church or school or place of work. There was a rage throughout the country that was really unique. And we ended up finding later on, it was the wrong call. But if we were to keep cooler heads and to listen to the folks that aren't yelling and banging on the table, we can avoid a lot of problems. And it's just the nature of the social media machine, right? Like now we understand that the human attention is captured by fear, uncertainty, doubt, and especially anger. The number of headlines I see, which is all hell breaks loose. Hell could only break loose so many times, right? Like,
Right.
how many times has it broken loose this year?
Yes.
I've lost count.
Right.
But it's now to a point where the problem is we put trust into the personalities we listen to, that they've done their homework. But we have to understand that all media is a business, right? The attack on publicly funded media is really unfortunate because news should be boring. I remember when the news would come on, and even when I was a kid, that was kind of the beginning. Like the 90s was the beginning of news shifting from hard news to more subjective opinion news and outrage news. And even then, like when there were big addresses, it was dry. It was boring stuff. I fell into it because I liked the legal logic. I liked the language puzzle of policy and law. And so I shifted from more of a STEM focus and as a math major in my first year to kind of start studying this relationship between technology, business, policy, and people. And policy always lags technology and business just by nature of the speed of those machines. But we're seeing an impact to people with AI today that we've not really faced before. And I don't think it's a fair assessment to say, oh, well, this is another issue of creative destruction. It happens. Like we don't have a form of government or an economic system that is ready to sustain the elimination of a lot of menial labor jobs. Like when I look at AI and how like I'm using it, I train it on my expertise as well as like the books of the leaders that I've found to be consistent with my approach to business. My approach is at the top. So when my model gives me outputs, I know that it's thinking the way that I've trained it to think, for better or worse.
Hmm.
But at least I have that governance over understanding where the outputs are coming from. But it's also kind of worrying, like not everyone can be a business owner, even though there's never been a better time. Not everyone can do that work. Not everyone wants to.
Hmm.
And when I'm looking at the work I'm automating, it's typically the work of entry level folks. Right. So like marketing is a really common area to go to, but like even product management, like, all right, we've identified the problems we're trying to solve and the people we're going to solve it for. Here are the main users. And then you get some lower level product managers to go write out the user stories. I don't need that step anymore, right? Like,
Right.
that's easy. So it's really an interesting shift. And unfortunately, like even in the presentation in 2022, the conclusion was we've always been led by technology leadership because policy lags behind. And it's to a point where we need our technology leaders to truly be the leaders of doing what's right. So, we get the question of, can AI replace my job? The answer is always going to be yes. Whether we're
Hmm.
talking, today or 10, 15 years, 20 years from now, combining AI with the robotics advances, everyone's going to be replaceable. The question is not can it? The question is, should it? And who will
Hmm.
allow it? And it's up to us to kind of set that barometer and to make sure that we have a gradual change. Although it doesn't seem that that's the direction we're going. It seems like we're taking let's jump in this race car and see how fast it can go. We'll build brakes later.
Because we have to beat adversary nations. What's your take on the dispute between Claude and Department of War and the guardrails where Anthropic was, and then you had OpenAI saying, "Oh, well, we believe the same thing Anthropic does," and then 3 hours later, it's like, and we came up with an agreement with DOW that we're now going to be replacing them. It's like, well, wait a second. Like, if it was literally the same concerns you had, how did you mitigate those so quickly? And I think the answer to the question is money, probably. But what was your take on that whole dust up?
It's not a fun look into the future, right? Like looking into the crystal ball these days is something I try to avoid doing because we're not setting ourselves up for the success that we should have with this technology. It's like giving an atom bomb to a bunch of cave dwellers and expecting them to come out with, universal power for other people. We weren't ready for it. I look at the release of ChatGPT, and I know everyone was really excited. I don't know if you remember your response, but my response was, this is evil. We are not ready for this.
Yeah, I was
This is
concerned.
not an effort to give us access to something powerful. This is an effort to further collect our data while they're building out these models that are going to take our jobs from us. And they're giving us no guardrails around it. The executive order we had on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI was really pretty basic. And for people that aren't in regulated industries, regulations are just common sense things. Like I always said to people, like compliance is your minimum. That's just table stakes. If you're
Yep.
only barely compliant, you're not ready. And you have to get above that. But it's hard when you look at the difference of financial motivations, which is revenue growth or profit growth, and your risk part of that, which is really an insurance policy. And so I've served all markets. I've had consumer products for a little bit, but mostly like SMB, mid-market to enterprise. And the SMB market, I think, is one of the greatest exposure points we have, both in terms of risks for humans as well as national security risks. It doesn't take a lot. I don't have to go after critical systems to shut down an economy. If I have 80% of the businesses in the United States are SMBs, and then I can do one attack like we saw with SolarWinds that cripples all
Hmm.
of that, that's enough to do a lot of damage to a country without going after the systems that are built up and formidable. So I think we have to do a lot more in terms of having funding for guidance for these guardrails. The guardrails in the executive order on AI was there's got to be humans in the loop for anything that could affect human lives. So that means now that we're seeing with health insurance, right? These small health practices are suffering like this AI onslaught of claims denials that they can't keep up with. They couldn't keep up with it before, right? Like no one thinks of like, and when I say like a small practice, like 15 to 20 doctors, or even fewer than that. These organizations, year over year, they make good money, but they're typically only 90 days from bankruptcy. Like they're pretty cash poor because of the complexity of what the payers have built around this system. So now they got rid of that executive order. So human in the loop for this sort of thing is no longer a requirement. And now you're just seeing denials. Like I got denied, this is before AI, but I got denied my first and only dental work in my life, which was my first cavity in my mid-30s. And it was 3 years of going back and forth with the payer just to get approval for a basic cavity fill. And their argument was, it's not cavity enough. What does that mean?
Right.
What does that mean? Like, and what am I supposed to do? Like, I'm not an expert in the coding of all this. I'm not an expert in how the claims are processed. I'm not an expert in the specific payer's language that's used. And these healthcare organizations, they need to have these experts that are trained in all this stuff. And they don't have the resources to take AI models, train them on all this complexity to help them combat it. But I'd argue they shouldn't be in that position in the first place. Like, why are we putting them in that position? And it kind of, if you look at it holistically, and sorry for the pattern matching here, but we used to have the concept before my time of sewage senators or sewer senators, right? They were guys who were coming in the 60s and 70s, spending a ton of money on infrastructure. Post World War II, it was all infrastructure. We're building roads, we're building plumbing, dams, power, all this stuff. And then all of a sudden, politicians realized if they can't mark a win in their term, they can't put any attention to it because they won't get reelected. So all of a sudden, we look back 40 years later and we're like, oh man, why did that sewage system blow up and pollute my river? Well, it's because it's 60 years old. The population has quadrupled since then, and it was never built for half that population. And we keep having a lot of talking points to infrastructure, and we did have a great infrastructure bill, which was so good. The rest of the world had to hurry up and catch up to it, right? We were on track. That one bill put us on track to lead in almost every manufacturing, especially around solar energy and more advanced manufacturing. So it's all kind of related to this focus on short-term benefits with a complete abstinence to long-term impact, right? And the law of unintended consequences, when we look at major technology changes, geopolitical changes, and technology, business, and policy are all linked. So when we know that there's going to be unintended consequences, we don't know the unknown unknowns, but that doesn't mean we have to just run without brakes, right? Like we know things are going to get bad. Why not address it now? Why not? Like what happens when we have a whole generation of students graduating with $500,000 in college debt and no one's going to hire to train them to do stuff that a model will do faster and better?
Yeah. How much do you think, especially going back to like infrastructure and things like that, have to do with today's world of identity politics, polarization? And one of the things that's always interesting to me is I find myself kind of right down the middle. People always say, oh, when you were at the Secret Service, where do you stand politically? I'm like, I hate both sides equally. I found them to be duplicitous. I find them like, I don't like politicians, period. Anybody who wants to go into that line of work, probably not somebody I'm going to be friends with because it's just such an odd business. But when you start talking to people that I'm friendly with that are much more politically involved than I am, and you say, hey, tell me a couple good things that the opposition has done. I can't think of a single one. I'm like, seriously? Do you have any independent thought? Like, it just seems like we've all co-opted. And because I was in New Hampshire when that infrastructure bill passed, and yeah, there was things that needed to get done, and the other side was against it because it wasn't theirs. And then it just flip-flops, and it just goes back and forth. And it's like, that's where I get really frustrated, where progress is halted because people fall into these identity politic trap games and to their own detriment.
Yeah, it ties back, I think, a lot to a combination of Citizens United and allowing corporations to participate in our political process, which corporations act in influence of money and profit, right? Nothing else. Legally, they have to take the most profitable options on the table, right? So it's not a matter of like evil. It's how they're built to operate. And the only thing that we could do is maybe take a page out of Germany's page book and put a mandatory labor representative on every board. There should also be a security representative on every board. Back to our original point, like
Hmm.
security and privacy needs to be on the board of every organization. But, to me, it's when the internet began, it was amazing. Like my wife and I would talk about it and be like, man, like what did people know before the internet? And my wife just said, people were dumb. We just didn't know shit. We
Hmm.
didn't know a damn thing. Right. Like we used to have conversations of like, hey, what's the answer to this question? And it would be kind of a round robin of everyone kind of positing their thoughts and like exercising their critical thinking and logic to kind of come up with what they think might be an answer of something that they have little to no information about. And if you wanted to get information, you had to get into your car and physically go to a library. I was probably one of the last, probably the only millennial generation. I'm a zillennial, I think I'm called,
Okay.
that spent a lot of college in the library, just in the stacks of the legal library, and one of which was Doheny, which is where Ghostbusters that
Oh,
stack
no kidding.
stack
Okay.
was themed.
Yeah, yeah.
So that was both fun and kind of eerie when it's like 3 a.m. and you're in the stacks alone and you hear a book fall and you're like, oh God, Ghostbusters. But you had to put real effort just to get information, let
Mhm.
alone to extract it to get the knowledge. Like just getting information was hard. Now information is super easy. Now expert driven information is very easy. And we've kind of lost our way, right? Like what happened to, the wise man is the one who plants a tree under which the shade he'll never enjoy. Like what
Mhm.
happened to those sorts of thoughts? Now I feel like I'm the old man saying like, oh, my goal is to give my son an easier and better life than I had. I'm not going to shame him for not having to go through the like poverty that I grew up in Section 8 housing and in kind of gritty neighborhoods. I'm giving him a much different life, and I don't
Mhm.
begrudge him for that. That was the goal. And so I think as we move forward, we have to really pull back and start really focusing on effort and reward relationships. And that's what I do with sports. That's why I don't like coaching, like getting involved with like the travel teams and like the monetization of our youth. There are so many valuable lessons, especially with baseball, which is a very skill-driven sport.
Sure.
Right? Like you don't have to be a good athlete to be a great baseball player. You just need to put the time in to get that skill developed, and then you can compete. And I was a late bloomer in terms of like physically growing. So I had to switch out of water polo and other sports where I was competing directly with kids because I was never bigger or stronger than anyone.
Mhm.
But I had great technique. So I was able to, letter in high school, and, had a great time being a very competitive player. And I think that is one of the things we really need to drive home with not just our children, but with ourselves. Like are screens bad for kids? They're bad for humans. I'd argue it's
Mhm.
a human issue. It's not a youth issue.
Yeah. No, I like seeing those images of everybody just staring at their hand and because they removed the phones. And it's just like we've just become completely co-opted by these devices. I'm guilty as well. Like even little things and going back to the conversation about prior to the internet, I was lucky enough to be born where I graduated from high school without like the internet was just becoming a thing. And I think people put more effort into learning something. It was not easy to just claim to be like an expert in something when they're not because they didn't have access to that. So that's one thing I noticed, and it always brings me back to like that scene in Goodwill Hunting when they're at the bar and Matt Damon's talking to the guy that is just like parroting what everybody else says. Like you get that now on the internet, but in those days you didn't get that because people didn't have access to that. But it will be an interesting thing to see our generation, your son's generation, my kids' generation that are in their now 20s that are digitally native from the beginning. And to see in 2 or 3 generations, what does that look like? Because one of the things that I have noticed, even with myself, is I've become lazy too, where instead of really spending time and reading up on a subject and learning it, I'll take the Cliff Notes version, which is now, Cliff Notes is now basically ChatGPT or, whatever you're using. And so it'll be interesting to see how that falls in the next several. I'm not in love with the prospects, but I do think, especially in the US with innovation, I'm still optimistic that we're gonna turn out okay. What are some things that you're optimistic about? Is there anything in particular that you find that, because right now, too, you said everything's anger, everything's doom and gloom. You go online and it's, oh, this expert predicted the stock market to crash, and this expert predicted, Al Gore's still saying that, that the climate's going to ruin us all, and food shortages, and now it's population decline. Well, wait a second, we had too many people, now we don't have enough people. Like, I don't
Yeah.
get it. But what are you optimistic about?
Again, I think that this technology set for now is really terrific for new entrepreneurs. It also makes the process of gaining knowledge and expertise a lot easier than it used to be. Efforts that used to take me a few weeks just because I have to research and find the data sources and then I go through and validate and, analyze. I can collapse that into like a day or two of work now. And that's really useful. But that comes from a background of knowing how to do it the proper way. So,
Yeah.
it's kind of like in math, right? Like you learn how to do the algebra before you get to the calculus. And, when you're in physics, using calculus makes everything easy. When you're taking calculus as a math course, it's hard, but like it's way easier to calculate what we need to fly planes, drive boats, cars, all this stuff with this advanced math without having to do the pages and pages of algebra that it used to take before you got there. And we just have to focus on the basics. I think education, our educators are seeing it and they're trying to move, but I'm positive about that, but I'm also a little concerned because it seems they're being pushed against. Like right now, like in Georgia, we had a teacher shortage, but then suddenly we're cutting the public education budget. So it's like, I thought that we had a problem and now we're making it worse. It doesn't make sense to me what we're doing there. But it really seems that the advances that we're going to see in rare diseases, amazing, right? Like
Mhm.
the things that we can do in health and medical science and the life sciences industry overall is very exciting. But again, I'm concerned in the ways that we're going about it. Right. So I'm positive that to take an analogy, if you want to have well behaved, obedient children, there are ways to go about it. Right. And the way that you go about it, I would argue, is more important than the result. Right. If I punch my kid in the face every time he mouths off or doesn't hop to when I say, he might be obedient to me, but I'm not a good parent if I'm doing that. And
Right.
so a lot of the positive things that we're trying to march towards, so it's like, hey, everyone vote for this because the output is so positive and good, but the means to getting there is so terribly irresponsible and unsafe and damaging. I'm concerned that we're going to be lulled into really dangerous decisions by generally positive and agreeable outputs. And I think that's the kind of the language puzzle that we're faced with today is I'd say corruption in government, right? Sure. Show me any operation on the planet and it's not 100% efficient. Like 100% is not reality. So is there corruption, waste, and fraud and abuse in this agency, this agency, this company, this company? The answer is always going to be yes, in some capacity. Does it mean we need to defund the department that protects our digital assets? Does it mean that we need to just blanket fire entire agencies? No, the means is important. And I think we're unfortunately going to learn how hot that kettle is by touching it. But I'm generally positive about, we have great companies like Duality, Opaque Systems that are bringing responsible ways to handle sensitive data so that we can get these great insights like the work Dana-Farber is doing now with the UK. Like those are the things that I'm really excited about. And I'm impatiently waiting for the rest of the market to understand that safe and secure and trustworthy technology, whether we're talking AI or anything, is on the table today. And it's a choice.
Yeah. No, it is. I like to say I'm also waiting patiently, but I'm also not all that optimistic that they're gonna. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the money, right? But to your point, that's also what I'm optimistic about is really good companies that are doing the right thing and just trying to get wider adoption at the same time. And it's a very confusing time for people, for buyers, for everybody. And so we'll have to see, and I'll have to have you come on in 6 months, and we'll see where we're at and what the latest is.
And the big takeaway I keep trying like of all the things to understand, it it kind of goes back to the old 90s GI Joe, knowledge is power and knowing is
Hmm.
half the battle. And information is absolutely power. You have fiction and nonfiction shows about Russian compromat and, all these things of information being used against people, blackmail. We see it in crime. Information is power. And I tell my son, you should stay private because every time you do something, you're giving away your power. So, keep those things close to vest. I say, for me, we didn't know better. I put things
Yeah.
on MySpace that are the reasons I never ended up going into politics. My whistle was broken when I whistle blew in the state of California and I went back to software. But everything we do is now recorded and it's
Yeah.
information that has power over us. We don't have power over that. And we need to advocate for it while we're waiting for the right people to do the right thing. We just have to be mindful that you're giving away power every time you fill out a form, every time you log into an application and then tell it what type of information you like, every time you watch a video, and the administration's asking for all this information. They want to
Hmm.
see what we're all watching, and they want to start actually investigating people for watching certain content. So this is not a tinfoil hat paranoia Mel Gibson conspiracy theory plot line.
Hmm.
It's real life, and it's happening now.
And around the world. I mean, it's when you hear about the lack of free speech in other previously free countries, it's very alarming. Nevertheless, well, Derek, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to catching up to you. It's always a pleasure, my friend. And yeah, best of luck to you throughout 2026 and beyond.
Likewise, sir. Thank you.
So, all right, thank you, and thank you everybody for listening to this week's episode of Detonation Point presented by Elastio. We'll see you next week.